This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. There is a kind of disappearance no one talks about because it does not look like tragedy. It does not look like a woman falling apart in public. It does not look like missed bills, unanswered messages, or some dramatic breakdown in a parking lot with mascara running down her face. It looks much cleaner than that. Much more respectable. Much easier to hide. It looks like a woman who still gets up on time. A woman who still shows up. A woman who still remembers the grocery list, the password, the dentist appointment, the birthday card, the tone she is supposed to use in emails, the way everyone likes their coffee, the exact expression she needs to wear so nobody asks too many questions. It looks like a woman whose life is still moving. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that movement, something has gone eerily still. That was the part no one could see. There was a season of my life when I looked fine in every way that makes people stop looking closer. I was functioning. I was responsible. I was doing what had to be done. If you had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I probably would have said no. Not because I was lying. Because I did not yet have the language for what was happening to me. I was not broken. I was not in ruins. I was not even especially unhappy. I was just slowly, quietly, professionally disappearing from my own life. And one of the first places I saw that disappearance was in the mirror. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way. It was subtler than that. More intimate. More unsettling. It was the moment I realized I had stopped getting ready as if I was someone worth arriving for. I do not mean I stopped being clean. I do not mean I stopped being presentable. I mean I stopped reaching for myself. I stopped choosing things with care. I stopped noticing what made me feel alive, elegant, soft, awake, recognizable. I stopped treating my own reflection like a place I still lived. I would throw something on, tie my hair back, move through the day, and tell myself it did not matter. I would call it practicality. I would call it being busy. I would call it maturity. I would call it having bigger things to care about. But after a while, that explanation started to feel dishonest. Because the truth was not that I had outgrown beauty. The truth was that I had grown used to neglecting myself in ways that looked normal from the outside. And that is what makes this kind of loss so dangerous. No one interrupts it. No one pulls you aside and says, "You are still functioning, but you are fading." No one tells women how easy it is to become efficient at the cost of becoming visible to themselves. So before I go any further, if you have ever felt that strange ache of being capable and exhausted, composed and disconnected, still moving but no longer quite present inside your own life, subscribe to the channel. Stay with me here. Because I make these videos for women who are not looking for noise. Women who are not looking to be lectured or hyped up or sold some glittering lie about reinvention. I make them for women who want language for what they feel, and for the quiet ways we can begin returning to ourselves. What shook me was not that I looked bad. It was that I looked like someone who had become purely functional. Like a woman who knew how to keep a day running, but no longer knew how to inhabit it. And I think many women know this feeling more deeply than they admit. Especially women who have spent years being needed. Women who have built lives, held homes together, survived marriages, left marriages, raised children, buried parents, rebuilt careers, kept promises, made dinners, swallowed disappointment, learned how to be dependable even when no one was particularly dependable to them. Women who have become so skilled at carrying life that they do not notice when life stops holding them back. That kind of woman does not always fall apart. Sometimes she just becomes invisible in slow motion. She wears whatever is easiest. She buys what is practical. She postpones care. She tells herself she will come back to herself when work settles down, when the kids need less, when her body changes, when money loosens, when she feels better, when she has a reason. And that when becomes a hallway with no end. That is what I had to face. I had been living as if I needed to earn the right to feel beautiful again. Not beautiful in the shallow sense. Not admired. Not envied. Not displayed. Beautiful in the quieter sense. Integrated. Intentional. At home inside myself. There is something haunting about realizing you have not been cruel to yourself exactly, just absent. That was the shock for me. I was waiting for some future version of my life to begin before I allowed myself the dignity of care. As if tenderness were a reward. As if effort were something I should save for the woman I might become later, not the woman standing here now, carrying all of this, doing her best not to disappear. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. I realized that the reason I started caring about how I looked again had almost nothing to do with vanity. It had to do with evidence. I needed some visible evidence that I had not abandoned myself. I needed to feel, even in small ways, that I was still worth the extra 5 minutes. The better blouse. The earrings instead of none. The lotion before bed. The perfume on a weekday. The jeans that fit now, not 10 pounds from now. The brush pulled carefully through my hair instead of the rushed hand that treated my body like a task to complete. Those things may sound small to someone who has never been lonely inside a full life. But they were not small to me. They were signals. Proof that I was still in there. Proof that I was not just performing adulthood, but living inside it. Proof that I had not become a machine built to respond, provide, soothe, organize, and endure. That is why this conversation matters to me so much. Because I know what it is to look stable and feel unclaimed. I know what it is to be admired for strength when what I really needed was permission to be tended to. I know what it is to become so good at surviving that even my own reflection starts to look like someone I only pass by. And I also know this. Sometimes the return does not begin with a life change. Sometimes it begins with attention. With noticing. With telling the truth. With admitting that the woman in the mirror has been surviving on scraps of care and calling it enough. That is where this story begins for me. Not with confidence. Not with transformation. Not with a makeover. With a haunting realization that I was present in my life, but absent from myself. And once a woman feels that clearly enough, she cannot unknow it. She starts to want more than functioning. She starts to want herself back. That is what this is really about. Not looking younger. Not looking expensive. Not looking perfect. Looking like I have not left myself behind. And the truth is, once I understood that, everything changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But deeply enough that even the smallest choices started to mean something different. Because when a woman begins to care for her appearance from that place, she is not decorating her life. She is returning to it. Before the hacks, I had to stop waiting to be worth the effort. There is a particular kind of postponement that looks responsible from the outside. It does not announce itself as self-rejection. It sounds reasonable. Mature, even. It wears the language of timing, discipline, priorities. It says, I will deal with myself later. I will buy better clothes when my weight settles. I will fix my hair when life calms down. I will start taking care of my skin when work is less demanding. I will spend money on myself when everyone else needs less from me. I will return to myself when I have earned it. For a long time, I did not realize how much of my life was built around that kind of waiting. I did not think of it as punishment. I thought of it as practicality. I thought I was being wise by delaying pleasure, delaying softness, delaying care. I told myself there were more pressing things. More deserving things. More urgent things. And because there usually were, it became very easy to keep moving my own needs to the bottom of the pile without ever having to admit what I was really doing. What I was really doing was placing conditions on my own worth. Not in some dramatic way. Not consciously. I was not waking up in the morning and saying, "I do not deserve care." It was quieter than that. It lived in tiny decisions repeated over months, then years. I would pass by things that might have made me feel a little more like myself and tell myself, "Not yet." I would look at women who seemed put together and assume they had reached some invisible threshold I had not reached. They were thinner, happier, richer, more healed, more chosen, more settled. Somewhere along the way, I had absorbed the idea that effort belonged to women who had already arrived. And I had not arrived. I was still carrying too much. Still becoming. Still recovering from things I could not explain in one sentence. Still trying to understand the shape of my own life. So I made a private agreement with myself. I would wait. I would wait until I felt better, looked better, had more certainty, had more time, had more proof that I was worth the trouble. That kind of agreement can steal years from a woman. Because until is one of the most seductive words in the world. It gives postponement a halo. It makes abandonment sound temporary. It lets me believe I am still planning to care for myself, just not now. Just not in this season. Just not in this body. Just not with this bank account, this schedule, this face, this level of exhaustion, this amount of grief. The trouble is, life is almost never done asking things of me. There is always one more bill, one more family concern, one more transition, one more emotional weather system moving through the week. If I make self-respect dependent on ideal conditions, I will never quite get there. I will keep standing outside the doorway of my own life, telling myself I will step in once the room is cleaner, quieter, more deserving of my entrance. I think this happens to many women because we become fluent in usefulness before we become fluent in care. We learn how to produce, manage, contain, smooth over, absorb, and endure. We become excellent at being necessary. But being necessary is not the same as being cherished, and over time that confusion can harden into identity. I start to believe my value lives in what I hold together, not in the fact that I am here. So when it comes time to spend energy on myself, a strange discomfort appears. Even if no one else is stopping me, something inside me does. A voice that asks whether this is really the right time. Whether I should be doing something more practical. Whether this money, this time, this attention should go elsewhere. Whether I have done enough to justify it. That voice can sound responsible. It can even sound moral. But I do not think it is wisdom. I think, very often, it is deprivation that has learned how to speak politely. The shift for me came when I began to understand that waiting to feel worthy is not a neutral act. It changes the texture of a life. It teaches me to relate to myself as a project that must first be corrected before it can be cared for. It turns care into a reward instead of a relationship. And that changes everything. Because if care is a reward, then I will only offer it to myself after performance. After progress. After visible improvement. After enough suffering has been converted into something admirable. But if care is a relationship, then it belongs to me in the middle of unfinished things. In the middle of ambiguity. In the middle of the body I have today, the schedule I have today, the emotional weather I have today. That realization was not glamorous. It was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I had been living as though the future version of me were more deserving of tenderness than the current one. As though the woman carrying all of this now should make do with less. Less beauty. Less softness. Less attention. Less delight. Less dignity. And I had normalized that so thoroughly that it barely registered as loss. There is a cruelty in that, even when it is gentle. Even when it comes disguised as discipline. Especially because women are so often praised for being low maintenance, adaptable, selfless, uncomplaining. We know how to make do. We know how to postpone. We know how to tell ourselves that this is not the season for us. But there is a point where resilience begins to eat through the edges of a woman's aliveness, and no one notices because she is still functioning. I noticed it in smaller moments first. In how quickly I dismissed things that would have made me feel more present. In how easily I spent on necessities but hesitated over anything that felt like care. In the way I kept imagining a better version of myself as the one who would finally be allowed to receive what I withheld from myself now. I had to ask a harder question than the usual beauty questions. Not what should I buy? Not what routine should I start? Not what trick would make me look more polished. The harder question was this: why had I accepted the idea that effort should be reserved for a later version of me? That question does not have one clean answer. Some of it came from exhaustion. Some from conditioning. Some from heartbreak. Some from the very ordinary erosion that happens when a woman spends years responding to life instead of inhabiting it. But once I asked the question honestly, I could see the pattern everywhere. And I could no longer pretend that postponement was harmless. It was shaping my relationship with myself. It was teaching me that I belonged at the end of the line. It was reinforcing the quiet fiction that I would become worthy somewhere in the future, instead of allowing me to practice worthiness now. I do not mean worthiness in the abstract, in the language of slogans and affirmations and polished little truths meant to make a hard life sound easier. I mean something more concrete than that. I mean the willingness to stop treating myself like an optional expense. The willingness to let my own life include me. The willingness to say, even here, even now, even before everything is resolved, I am still someone I must not neglect. That was the foundation under everything that came after. Before any habits, before any routines, before any so-called hacks, I had to stop negotiating with my own humanity. I had to stop acting as though care would become appropriate only after I had fixed enough, proven enough, endured enough. Because a woman can lose herself for years inside that bargain. And the most important thing I changed was not my appearance, at least not at first. It was the decision to stop making my own tenderness wait. My best budget secret was never money. It was structure. For a long time, I thought the women who always seemed composed had access to something I did not. More money, obviously. Better closets. Better lighting in their homes. Better mornings. Better energy. Better luck. I assumed there was some invisible advantage moving underneath their lives, something smooth and elegant and out of reach, something that made it easier for them to look calm, polished, and prepared while I felt like I was always assembling myself in the final 5 minutes before walking out the door. But the longer I watched women closely, and the more honestly I watched myself, the more I realized that money was only part of the picture. Sometimes a very small part. What separated a woman who looked consistently put together from one who always felt a little scattered was often not glamour. It was structure. That word changed everything for me. Because once I stopped thinking of beauty as an event and started thinking of it as a system, my whole relationship with getting dressed, getting ready, and taking care of myself began to soften. I had been treating every day as if it were a fresh emergency. Every outfit was a last-minute decision. Every morning was a negotiation with time. Every product I needed was somewhere, but not where I needed it. Every small act of care had to fight its way through fatigue, clutter, indecision, and the low-grade chaos that comes from living without a framework. That kind of chaos is expensive in ways people do not always notice. It costs money because I buy duplicates of things I cannot find. It costs energy because I make too many choices before 8 a.m. It costs confidence because I leave the house feeling half-finished. It costs self-trust because when a woman repeatedly feels behind in her own life, she begins to carry that lateness in her body. Even if no one says a word, she feels it. She moves through the day slightly apologetic, slightly rushed, slightly disconnected from herself. I think many women believe they need more discipline when what they actually need is less friction. That was true for me. I did not need to become a different person. I needed to stop building a daily life that made care unnecessarily hard. I needed a rhythm. I needed fewer moving parts. I needed things to have a place. I needed to make decisions before I was tired. I needed to respect the fact that my best intentions were never going to survive a life with no support underneath them. Structure, at its best, is not harsh. It is not rigid. It is not a punishment for being busy or forgetful or human. It is a kindness. It is a way of leaving something helpful for the version of me who will wake up tomorrow already carrying enough. Once I understood that, I stopped romanticizing spontaneity in areas of life where I was actually craving steadiness. I began with something simple. I stopped asking every morning to perform a miracle. I cannot overstate how much of my stress used to come from trying to invent myself from scratch each day. Not because I was especially fashionable, but because I had too many options in the wrong places and not enough clarity anywhere. Clothes I did not love. Products I forgot to use. Good pieces buried behind things I had outgrown. Half decisions everywhere. Nothing coordinated with anything. It was not that I had nothing to wear. It was that my life had no visual logic. And when a woman's environment has no logic, getting ready becomes emotionally louder than it should be. So I started building what I can only describe as a gentle structure. Not an aesthetic prison. Not some hyper-optimized lifestyle that required color-coded bins and military precision. Just enough shape around my routines that I no longer had to rescue myself every day. I made categories. I made defaults. I created what I think of now as levels of effort, because not every day asks the same thing of me. Some mornings I have time, energy, music on in the background, and room to enjoy the process. Other mornings I am depleted before my feet even hit the floor. If my routine only works on my best days, then it does not really work. That was one of the most useful truths I learned. A real routine has to love me in more than one condition. So I built a 5-minute version of getting ready, a 15-minute version, and a fuller version for days when I wanted more. That changed more than I expected. It removed the all-or-nothing feeling that used to sabotage me. I was no longer choosing between done properly and not done at all. I had options. I had a baseline. I had a way to remain in relationship with myself even on tired days. That same principle moved into my closet. I stopped treating repetition like failure. I stopped believing that I needed endless novelty in order to look polished. Repetition, when chosen well, is not boring. It is clarifying. It is how a woman learns what actually serves her. Once I found silhouettes, fabrics, colors, and combinations that consistently made me feel settled and strong, I stopped making my life harder by chasing variety for its own sake. There is a deep relief in knowing what works. Not because it makes life glamorous, but because it removes 1,000 small drains on attention. A woman with structure does not necessarily own more. Often she owns less, but uses it better. She knows where the good white shirt is. She knows which pants can be trusted. She knows the earrings that finish a look without demanding thought. She knows the lipstick that wakes up her face. She knows the shoes that can carry a long day without making her miserable by noon. That kind of knowledge is not shallow. It is intimate. It comes from paying attention. And I think that is why structure can feel so emotional once it begins working. Because it is not really about organization alone. It is about being supported by your own life. It is about no longer moving through the day as if everything must be solved in real time. It is about making your home, your routines, your closet, and your bathroom less adversarial. less random, less full of small betrayals. I noticed this especially on difficult weeks. There were still hard mornings. There were still seasons when I was tired, distracted, grieving, overextended, or simply not in the mood to care. Structure did not erase that. It did something more realistic. It carried me when my feelings could not. It let me borrow from decisions I had already made in calmer moments. It reduced the cost of continuing. That is what I think many women need, especially the ones who are always taking care of everything else. Not more pressure. Not more perfection. More support. And structure is a form of support we can create with almost no audience and often very little money. A basket with daily essentials where I can actually reach them. A small tray for jewelry I wear all the time. A default outfit formula for days when my mind is elsewhere. A Sunday reset that keeps Monday from feeling like an ambush. A handbag that stays partially packed. A place for the lint roller, the hand cream, the perfume, the brush. The quiet intelligence of reducing avoidable chaos. I used to think being put together was about effort in the visible moment. Now I think it often begins much earlier than that. In the hidden architecture of a woman's life. In whether she has made it easy or difficult to care for herself. In whether her daily environment supports her dignity or drains it. My best budget secret was never learning how to buy more with less. It was learning how to need less rescue from my own routines. Because once structure entered the room, beauty stopped feeling like a performance I had to summon out of nowhere. It started feeling like something steadier, quieter, more human than that. It started feeling possible on an ordinary day. Clothes first. I had to dress the woman I am, not the one I keep postponing. Clothing was the first place I had to tell myself the truth. Not because clothes are the most important thing in a woman's life. They are not. But they are often the first place where self-abandonment becomes visible. Before anyone hears me speak, before they know what kind of day I am having, before they know what I have survived or what I am carrying, there is the quiet language of what I chose to put on my body. And for a long time, what I put on my body told a story I was not brave enough to say out loud. It said, I am getting by. It said, this will do. It said, I am waiting. What I did not understand then was that I was not just dressing a body. I was dressing a relationship with myself. And that relationship had become full of delay. Delay dressed up as logic. Delay dressed up as discipline. Delay dressed up as realism. I kept buying for a future version of me, as if the woman I was living as now did not deserve to be met with care. I bought clothes for the body I planned to return to. The body from before stress settled in certain places. The body from before hormones changed things. The body from before grief, before exhaustion, before age added its own quiet handwriting. I kept telling myself that once I got back there, I would build the wardrobe I really wanted. I would buy the nice pants. I would invest in the coat. I would stop hiding in oversized things that neither flattered nor comforted me. I would learn my style once my life felt more stable, once my shape felt more cooperative, once I felt less in between. But in the meantime, I kept getting dressed every morning in clothes that carried a kind of emotional static. Things that fit technically but not kindly. Things that looked fine on a hanger but wrong on my actual life. Things bought out of fantasy, guilt, urgency, or old identity. And the cumulative effect of that was more serious than I let myself admit. Because when a woman repeatedly puts on clothes that do not honor the body she actually has, she begins the day in quiet opposition to herself. There is a subtle violence in that. Not dramatic violence. Not obvious cruelty. But a low, steady friction. The feeling of pulling at a waistband all day. The feeling of standing in front of a mirror trying to negotiate with a silhouette that keeps refusing to become someone else. The feeling of wearing something because it is all that fits, all that is clean, all that once looked good, all that might pass. The feeling of being dressed, but not accompanied. I think many women live there for years. Especially women in the middle of life, where the body is no longer a fixed story. It is changing, speaking, asking, resisting. Weight moves. Texture changes. Comfort matters more. Tolerance for performance gets lower. And yet the culture around women still whispers that style belongs most naturally to the very young, the very thin, the very current, the very visible. So if I am not careful, I start thinking style is something I had, or something I will have again later, rather than something I can build honestly now. That was the shift I had to make. I had to stop dressing for a reunion with some postponed self and start dressing the woman who was showing up every day in my actual life. That required more honesty than I expected. Because it is one thing to say I accept where I am. It is another thing to build a wardrobe around that acceptance. To look at the body I have now and ask, without punishment, what lets her move beautifully through a day? What lets her sit, walk, work, bend, drive, eat, breathe, and still feel intact? What makes her look like she belongs to herself? What makes her look less like she is apologizing for taking up space? Once I began asking those questions, my idea of style became much less performative and much more intimate. I stopped being so interested in what looked impressive on other women and started paying attention to what felt coherent on me. Not what looked good in a photograph taken in the right light at the right angle, but what held up in the lived hours of a day. What still looked elegant at 3 p.m. What did not collapse after one meeting, one errand, one meal, one moment of fatigue. What made me stand differently? What quieted the restless self-consciousness that comes from wearing something that never really belonged to me? I also had to admit that I had been confusing style with aspiration. I was buying clothes for the woman I admired from a distance, not the woman whose life I was actually living. A woman in some imagined apartment in Manhattan, perhaps, stepping out in shoes that make no sense for my errands, my knees, my weather, my days. A woman who glides from lunch to gallery opening without needing to carry 3 practical things in her bag. A woman who does not need a blazer to move from school pickup to work calls to dinner without changing twice. There is nothing wrong with admiration. But admiration becomes costly when it blinds me to my own reality. Real style, at least for me, became less about fantasy and more about translation. How do I translate the life I actually have into something graceful? How do I dress in a way that respects my age without surrendering to invisibility? How do I honor comfort without sliding into carelessness? How do I let clothes support me, rather than challenge me all day? That is where the idea of a personal uniform became less like fashion advice and more like emotional intelligence. I began to understand that my life did not need endless options. It needed reliable shapes. Certain pants that always worked. Certain necklines that softened my face. Certain fabrics that moved with enough weight to look intentional but not stiff. Certain layers that added structure without making me feel trapped. Certain dresses that did not require me to monitor my body every 10 minutes. Once I found those things, repetition stopped feeling lazy. It started feeling like self-knowledge. There is dignity in repeating what serves me. There is dignity in no longer forcing myself into silhouettes that belong to some younger, thinner, more performative version of femininity. There is dignity in choosing clothes that allow me to be both composed and comfortable, polished and real. I do not think women talk enough about how much energy is wasted trying to maintain a visual relationship with an old self. At some point, I had to decide whether I wanted to keep mourning a body, a season, a style identity that had passed, or whether I wanted to become fluent in the one I had now. And becoming fluent in the present version of myself required curiosity, not criticism. I had to learn proportion again. Learn what my height asked for. Learn which hemlines felt elegant instead of awkward. Learn that tailoring was not vanity but translation. Learn that a good jacket can rescue a simple outfit, and that a bad fabric can cheapen even the most expensive one. Learn that color matters differently now. That some shades drained me, while others brought me back into focus. That the right earring near my face can do more than another unnecessary top. That shoes are never just shoes, they alter posture, pace, mood, and the entire sentence an outfit is trying to speak. I also learned to edit with more emotional honesty. Some clothes were not wrong because they were ugly. They were wrong because they made me shrink. They made me tug, conceal, flatten, retreat. They carried stories I no longer wanted to keep repeating. Maybe they belonged to an old job, an old marriage, an old insecurity, an old attempt to be palatable. Maybe they looked good on paper but bad on my spirit. I had to let those things go, not because they were unfashionable, but because they kept me in conversation with someone I was no longer trying to become. That, I think, is the deepest work of style in midlife. Not reinvention for applause. Recognition. To get dressed and feel, quietly, there I am. Not perfect. Not transformed. Not turned into someone else. Just more visible to myself. More intentional. Less postponed. Clothes were the first place I practiced that kind of honesty because they meet me at the threshold of every day. And once I stopped dressing for a future that kept moving farther away, I found something much more stabilizing than aspiration. I found relief. I found a way to meet the life I already had with a little more elegance, a little more mercy, and a lot less waiting. Hair changed for me when I stopped treating it like a problem to solve. Hair became different for me when I stopped speaking about it as if it were a recurring inconvenience in my life. That sounds simple, but it was not a small shift. For a long time, my hair existed in my mind as something that needed to be handled, managed, corrected, hidden, stretched, fixed, refreshed, softened, tamed, or made acceptable. Even on days when I was trying to care for myself, there was often this quiet irritation underneath the process, as if my hair were another item on a list of things demanding labor from me. Something unpredictable. Something with moods. Something that would cooperate or refuse, and if it refused, it had the power to alter how I felt about my whole face, my whole outfit, my whole day. I do not think women always realize how much emotion gets stored in hair. Hair is rarely just hair. It carries history. It carries memory. It carries race, femininity, age, control, desirability, rebellion, shame, and sometimes grief. It remembers the years when I wanted it to look like someone else's. It remembers the versions of me who thought beauty had a very narrow set of rules. It remembers every season in which I was trying to become more acceptable to a world that had already decided certain textures, densities, colors, and changes were easier to admire than others. So when I say hair changed for me when I stopped treating it like a problem to solve, what I really mean is that I stopped approaching it as an adversary. I stopped asking, how do I make this less troublesome? And I started asking, what does my hair need from me in order to be lived with well? That question softened something in me immediately. Because the first question is rooted in frustration. The second is rooted in relationship. For years, I think I had absorbed the idea that a woman's hair was supposed to look effortless, but the effort behind that effect was supposed to remain invisible. If it took too long, cost too much, frizzed too quickly, thinned in certain places, changed with hormones, or required actual adaptation, then it felt like failure. It felt personal. It felt like I was behind in some way. As though other women had solved it and I had not. As though polished womanhood came naturally to everyone else and I was still backstage trying to hold something together with pins and hope. But that is not how most women actually live. Most women are not gliding through their lives with permanently perfect hair untouched by weather, age, stress, or time. Most women are negotiating with real conditions: humidity, dryness, color damage, postpartum shedding, gray roots, a widening part, a changing texture, a scalp that has become more sensitive than it used to be, hair that once obeyed and now has its own separate philosophy, hair after heartbreak, hair after illness, hair during perimenopause, hair after years of heat, years of dye, years of trying to look composed through seasons that did not feel composed at all. Once I stopped expecting my hair to symbolize effortless control, I was able to see it more tenderly. I began to understand that caring for my hair was not about forcing it into submission. It was about paying attention, noticing what had changed, noticing what it responded to, noticing what I kept doing out of habit that was no longer serving me. I had to admit that some of the frustration I felt toward my hair was really frustration with change itself. With time. With the fact that my body was not staying still for me. Hair was just one of the places where that truth was visible. And visibility can be emotional. Especially for women who have spent years being read before they are known. Hair is one of the first things people notice, and because of that, it can become loaded with performance. Am I polished enough? Youthful enough? Soft enough? Professional enough? Feminine enough? Modern enough? Relaxed enough? Intentional enough? I think many women carry those questions without saying them aloud. We act as though the issue is simply styling, when often the issue is more intimate than that. We are trying to manage perception, and that can turn hair into a site of constant vigilance. I got tired of living like that. I got tired of needing my hair to prove something every day. What changed me was not some magic routine or one perfect product. What changed me was deciding that my hair was part of my body, not a separate problem attached to it. That may sound obvious, but it did not feel obvious to me for a long time. Once that landed, I began treating hair care less like emergency maintenance and more like stewardship. The kind, patient care I offer anything I intend to keep in good condition for the long haul. That meant starting at the root, literally and emotionally. I paid attention to my scalp. I paid attention to breakage. I paid attention to dryness, tension, and what happened when I kept choosing convenience over health. I stopped only reacting once things looked bad. I began building smaller rituals that made my hair feel less like a crisis and more like a living part of my life. Washing it with a little more patience. Conditioning it like I meant it. Reducing the amount of resentment in my own hands. That mattered more than I expected. There is a difference between handling your hair and tending to it. One is rushed and slightly annoyed. The other is relational. And women know the difference, even if nobody else can see it. I also had to become more honest about skill. Part of why hair felt so emotionally loud to me at times was because I had left too much of my peace in other people's hands. Their schedule. Their pricing. Their idea of what I meant. Their mood that day. Their level of care. Their interpretation of natural. Sleek. Soft. Trim. Just a little off the ends. I do not think every woman needs to become her own full-time stylist, but I do think there is a quiet dignity in knowing how to do enough for yourself that your confidence is not always waiting on an appointment. That was a powerful shift for me. Not because I suddenly became perfect at it, but because I stopped being helpless in my own upkeep. I learned a few styles that could carry me through real life. Not fantasy life. Real life. A quick style for tired mornings. A polished style for workdays. A soft style for weekends. Something reliable for weather that wanted to undo me. Something protective for the weeks when I did not want my appearance to require too much from me. Once I had those, I did not feel so vulnerable to every fluctuation in time, money, or energy. That is one of the most underrated parts of beauty on a budget: competence. Not mastery. Competence. The ability to create order without always outsourcing it. The ability to recover from a less than perfect outcome without spiraling into self-disgust. The ability to say, "This is not my favorite hair day, but it is still my head, my life, my face, and I am still going outside." That kind of steadiness matters. Because perfection is not what makes a woman look put together. Familiarity does. Ease does. The feeling that she understands the materials of her own life and is not constantly at war with them. Hair contributes to that more than people realize. When my hair is in a style that suits my actual week, when it feels healthy enough, when I have not neglected it into resentment, I move differently. I touch my face less. I second-guess less. I feel less interrupted by myself. I also began to think differently about what a good hair day means. A good hair day used to mean impressive. Now it means coherent. It means my hair belongs to the same life as the rest of me. It fits the day I am actually living. It supports my features instead of competing with them. It does not ask me to become someone more glamorous, more youthful, more controlled than I really am. It simply helps me feel accompanied in my own appearance. That is enough. In fact, for this season of life, that is more than enough. There is a tenderness in accepting that not every day requires salon-level results in order to still feel intentional. Not every day requires drama, volume, reinvention, or visible effort. Sometimes looking cared for is quieter than that. A clean part. A healthy sheen. A style that holds. A shape that flatters. A softness near the face. The absence of struggle. The sense that I have not neglected myself, even if I have not performed beauty to its highest possible standard. That is where hair finally became a source of peace instead of friction. Not because it became easy, but because I stopped asking it to carry all my insecurities about age, attractiveness, control, and identity. I stopped making it the villain in the story of my stress. I stopped talking about it as if it were forever failing me. And once I did that, I noticed something almost immediately. My hair did not need to become perfect for me to feel more beautiful. It needed to stop being treated like a problem I was always trying to solve. Clean, soft, and well kept. The kind of hygiene that feels like coming home to myself. There was a time when I treated hygiene like one more duty on a list that never ended. Something to get through quickly. Something functional. Something so basic that it barely seemed worthy of thought. I would shower because of course I showered. Brush my teeth because of course I brushed my teeth. Put on lotion when I remembered, skip it when I did not, rush through my evenings, rush through my mornings, rush through my own body as if I were a hallway I needed to pass through in order to get to the actual business of living. And for a long time, I did not realize what that pace was doing to me. Because there is a difference between maintaining a body and inhabiting one. A woman can be perfectly hygienic and still feel estranged from herself. She can be clean, appropriate, presentable, even attractive, and still carry this private sense that she has not really arrived inside her own skin in a very long time. I think many women know that feeling. Not because we do not know how to care for ourselves, but because we have learned to perform care in the fastest possible way. Efficiently. Quietly. Without taking up too much time, too much money, too much attention. We know how to stay acceptable. What we often forget is how to feel comforted by our own routines. That is what changed for me. Hygiene stopped being only about cleanliness, and started becoming one of the most immediate ways I could feel at home in myself again. Not glamorous. Not dramatic. Not some luxurious fantasy with endless products and candles lit in every corner. I mean something simpler than that. The feeling of stepping out of the shower and being truly clean. The feeling of washed skin that has not been rushed. The feeling of lotion on my arms before the day begins. The feeling of clean undergarments, moisturized feet, fresh breath, brushed hairline, hands that do not feel neglected, a body that has been touched with some degree of gentleness by the person living inside it. Those things are small until they are not. What I began to understand is that hygiene is one of the most private forms of self-respect. It happens before anyone sees me, before compliments, before the outside world, before the outfit, the makeup, the polished version of whatever I am going to present. It is the layer underneath all of that. The part that asks, when no one is watching, how do I live inside my body? With impatience. With avoidance. With contempt. With numbness. Or with enough tenderness to remind myself that this body is not just carrying me through life. It is my life. That realization shifted the emotional weight of ordinary things. A shower was no longer just a task. It became a reset. Not every time, not in some exaggerated way, but often enough that I noticed. There were evenings when I came home carrying the residue of a hard conversation, a crowded day, a mood I could not name, and the most honest comfort available to me was warm water and 10 unhurried minutes alone. Not because a shower solved anything. It did not. But because it helped me cross a threshold. It helped me leave one version of the day behind and enter the next without dragging every invisible thing all over the house with me. I think that matters more than people say. For women especially, hygiene is often spoken about either in a clinical way or in a performative way. Either strict necessity or elaborate beauty culture. But there is another dimension to it that feels almost spiritual, though I do not mean that in a lofty sense. I mean it in the grounded sense of returning. Returning to my senses. Returning to my breath. Returning to the simple truth that I live here, in this body, and the way I tend to it affects the tone of my whole inner life. That made me rethink the details. Clean skin mattered, yes, but so did the feeling of it afterward. A towel that was actually soft. A robe that felt calm instead of worn thin and resentful. Sheets that smelled clean. A body wash whose scent I associated not with seduction or performance, but with peace. A hand cream by the sink so I did not keep moving through the day with dry, overworked hands that told the story of how much I was doing and how little I was pausing. A toothbrush routine that was not just automatic but complete. Mouthwash. Floss. Lip balm. The private dignity of not neglecting the most ordinary things. I do not think women always understand how much emotional information the body stores. A heavy week shows up somewhere. Stress has texture. Grief has residue. Burnout changes the way I move through even the smallest acts of maintenance. There have been seasons in my life when even basic care felt harder than it should have. Not impossible. Just heavier. More distant. As though the body became another responsibility rather than a place of shelter. And in those seasons, I learned something important. When life feels emotionally unstable, simple physical care becomes more than maintenance. It becomes orientation. To wash my face. To clip my nails. To clean behind my ears. To put on deodorant with actual attention. To rub lotion into my elbows and knees instead of skipping over myself as if I were rushing past someone I did not really know. To change into clean sleep clothes at the end of a long day. To keep my feet soft, not because anyone would see them, but because I would. To notice when my body was asking for care before it had to start shouting. That kind of routine did not make me a different woman. It made me feel less abandoned by my own life. And I think that is one of the quiet truths no one says enough. Being well kept is often much less about impressing other people than it is about reducing friction between me and myself. When I am clean, moisturized, fresh, and cared for in small practical ways, I move through the world with less internal static. I do not feel as interrupted by my own body. I do not feel dragged down by preventable discomfort. I feel more settled, more available to the rest of my day. Softness became important to me too, in ways I had not expected. Not softness as weakness. Softness as relief. The softness of skin after body cream. The softness of a cotton nightgown after a difficult day. The softness of a clean towel. The softness of my own pace when I stopped treating every evening routine like a race. The softness of smelling faintly clean even when the day had been ugly. I think many women are hungry for softness and do not know where to place that hunger. We assume softness must come from romance, leisure, free time, a better season, someone else's tenderness. But sometimes softness can begin in much humbler places. In how I wash. In how I dry off. In whether my bathroom feels stocked for care or only stocked for survival. In whether I allow my private life to include any comfort that is not strictly earned. There is also something deeply stabilizing about consistency here. Not perfection. Not an immaculate ritual every single day. Life does not work like that. Bodies do not work like that. But a baseline of care that remains available to me even when I am not at my best. Especially then. That matters. Because on hard days, I do not need an elaborate routine. I need something reliable. Soap. Water. Clean clothes. Toothpaste. A comb. Lotion. Rest. The simple tools that help me re-enter myself when I have drifted too far into exhaustion or emotional noise. I became more aware, too, of how hygiene touches confidence in ways that are almost invisible from the outside. Fresh breath changes how freely I speak. Moisturized skin changes how I carry bare arms or crossed legs. Clean hairlines and neat brows change the feeling of my own face before I even add anything decorative. Even something as basic as clean underwear and clothes that smell right can alter the way I move through a room. None of this is flashy. That is precisely the point. It is foundational. Well-kept women are not always the women with the most expensive products or the most elaborate beauty routines. Often they are the women who have built a quiet intimacy with maintenance. They know what their body needs to feel comfortable. They know the difference between rushing through care and receiving it. They have learned that private upkeep is not trivial just because it is ordinary. That is how hygiene changed for me. It stopped being proof that I was presentable and became proof that I was present. Clean, soft, and well-kept no longer meant polished for display. It meant I had returned to myself in the most practical way available. Through water. Through touch. Through repetition. Through the deeply understated grace of not leaving my body behind while I hurried through my life. And for a woman who has spent years being useful, that kind of return can feel like a form of homecoming. Skincare, makeup, and the art of looking awake without looking performed. There came a point when I stopped wanting to look transformed and started wanting to look present. That distinction matters more than I knew when I was younger. In earlier years, makeup often felt like possibility, reinvention, a mood, a performance I could step into. There was pleasure in that, and I do not dismiss it. But somewhere along the way, especially as life became fuller, heavier, more layered, I found myself less interested in becoming visually impressive and more interested in looking like I had slept, breathed, and returned to my own face. Not flawless. Not younger. Not untouched by life. Just awake. That was the real shift for me in skincare and makeup. I stopped chasing the fantasy of looking redone, and started paying attention to what helped me look alive without looking performed. Because there is a difference. A woman can look polished in a way that still feels human, and she can also look so corrected, so overworked, so cosmetically arranged that something essential disappears. I did not want to disappear behind my own routine. I wanted to come into focus. I think many women reach that point quietly. We may still love beauty, still enjoy products, still appreciate a beautiful face of makeup, but our relationship to it changes. We begin to ask different questions. Not how do I cover everything? Not how do I copy what is trending on women 20 years younger under studio lights? Not how do I build a face for photographs alone? The questions become more intimate than that. What helps me look rested when I am not? What brings light back to my expression? What softens fatigue without denying that I have lived? What respects the face I have now rather than trying to force it into an older script? That was especially true for skincare. For a long time, I think I treated skincare like an argument I was trying to win against time. Hyperpigmentation, dullness, fine lines, texture, whatever was appearing or changing, I approached it with a certain low-level hostility, as though my face were constantly presenting new evidence that I was losing ground. The beauty industry is very good at feeding that mentality. It offers endless corrections, endless upgrades, endless reasons to scrutinize yourself more closely and purchase more urgently. And because the language around skincare often sounds clinical, even rational, it is easy to miss how emotional it becomes. Suddenly the mirror is no longer just a mirror. It is a report card. I had to step back from that. I had to stop treating my skin like a problem statement and start treating it like living tissue. Something responsive. Something changing. Something affected by sleep, stress, hormones, weather, diet, grief, age, and the ordinary wear of being alive in a body. That softened my approach immediately. It did not make me care less. It made me care more intelligently. Instead of buying hope in 10 different bottles, I began asking simpler questions. What does my skin actually need to stay steady? What helps, consistently? What irritates it? What is worth paying for, and what is just beautifully packaged confusion? I stopped trying to assemble an identity out of products and started building a routine around function. Cleanse. Treat what truly needs treating. Moisturize. Protect. Stay with it long enough to know whether it works. That kind of consistency is not glamorous, but it changed my face more than all the dramatic starts and stops ever did. There is something calming about finding a routine that does not emotionally exhaust me. I think women underestimate how much beauty fatigue comes not from effort itself, but from constant novelty. Every week there is another miracle ingredient, another must-have serum, another influencer pressing urgency into my screen. But a face cannot relax inside that kind of noise. Neither can a budget. Once I gave myself permission to stop chasing improvement like a moving target, skincare became less anxious. It became maintenance in the best sense. Not passive. Not careless. Just grounded. And then there was makeup. Makeup became better for me when I stopped asking it to do too much emotionally. I think that is where many women get tired without realizing it. We are not just applying product. We are often trying to solve a feeling. We want to look less tired, but also less vulnerable. More polished, but also less invisible. More confident, but also less scrutinized. More beautiful, but still believable. That is a lot to ask from a concealer and a brow pencil before 8 a.m. Once I admitted that, I became gentler with myself. I no longer wanted makeup to erase the fact that life leaves traces. I wanted it to support my face, not replace it. So I began looking more carefully at what actually made the biggest difference. Not what looked most dramatic in theory, but what shifted the feeling of my face in real life. A little brightness under the eyes. Brows with shape, because they frame expression more than people realize. Something on the lips that made me look less drained. A bit of warmth in the cheeks so I did not look like the day had already taken too much from me. Mascara, sometimes. Liner, only if it added clarity instead of heaviness. A base that evened things out without trying to turn my skin into a blank wall. I started thinking of everyday makeup less as decoration and more as translation. How do I translate my real face through bad lighting, long days, and the flattening effect of stress? How do I preserve expression? How do I make sure I still look like someone with blood in her body and thought in her eyes? That mattered more to me than perfection. Especially because makeup that is too deliberate can begin to feel like armor, and I did not want armor every day. I wanted recognition. I wanted to look in the mirror and see myself, only a little more awake, a little more gathered, a little more held together around the edges. That is where restraint became more powerful than excess. Not minimalism for its own sake. Not some rigid idea that mature women should disappear into neutral tones and tiny gestures. I do not believe that. I think a woman should wear the red lipstick, the soft shimmer, the bold brow, the deeper blush, whatever feels true to her. But I do think intention matters more with time. I became more aware of texture, of movement, of how product sits on skin that has lived. Heavy formulas can make a face look more tired, not less. Too much powder can turn presence into flatness. Too much correction can pull attention toward the very thing I was trying to soften. Light, in makeup, became something I started preserving rather than covering up. And light is not only visual, it is emotional. There is a version of makeup that says, "Look at what I have hidden." And there is another version that says, "I am here." The second one interested me more. That also changed how I think about favorite features. I used to hear that advice and assume it was simplistic, but it became useful once I understood it differently. Not as a trick. As a relationship. What part of my face still feels like home to me? My eyes, when they are not dulled by too much product. My mouth, when I remember that color can restore mood. My cheekbones, when I add warmth instead of trying to carve severity into my face. Once I worked with what I loved instead of only fixing what I feared, makeup felt less adversarial. That matters, especially for women who have spent years being looked at through the wrong lens. A lens of age panic. A lens of correction. A lens of comparison. A lens that turns every natural change into a flaw in need of intervention. I did not want to keep participating in that with my own hands. So I built something quieter. A routine that respected my mornings. Products that earned their place. A face that could survive the actual day, not just the first 10 minutes after application. Something I could do in one bathroom mirror, in ordinary light, while being fully myself. Something that worked whether I was going to a meeting, lunch, church, a doctor's appointment, or just out into the world where I still wanted to look like I had not disappeared. That is the art of it, I think. Not looking untouched. Not looking endlessly optimized. Not looking like I have performed femininity at the highest possible level before breakfast. Just looking awake enough to meet my own life. And for me, that became far more beautiful than transformation ever was. Smelling good, feeling grounded, why scent became part of my identity again. Of all the details that help a woman feel put together, scent may be the one people underestimate most. Not because it is louder than the others. It is not. In many ways, it is the opposite. Scent is subtle. Intimate. It does not announce itself the way a dress does, or a haircut, or lipstick. It lingers at the edges. It leaves an impression before most people can even explain what they noticed. And maybe that is exactly why it began to matter so much to me. It felt less like performance and more like atmosphere. Less like decoration and more like memory in real time. There was a season when I stopped thinking about fragrance altogether. Not because I did not love it, but because life had become so functional that scent started to feel unnecessary. I was getting through my days. I was showing up. I was doing what needed to be done. And somewhere in that practical rhythm, I quietly dropped the smaller things that made life feel textured. Fragrance was one of them. It began to seem like an extra, something reserved for better moods, better outfits, better occasions, a version of myself who was less tired and more available to beauty. But scent has a strange power. It waits for me. One day, I put on a fragrance I had not worn in a long time, and the effect was immediate in a way I did not expect. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just deeply recognizable. It was as if some part of me that had been sitting quietly in the background lifted its head and said, "There you are." That was the beginning of my return to scent. What moved me was not simply that I smelled good. It was that I felt located. Fragrance gave shape to my presence again. It made me feel less like a collection of tasks and more like a woman inhabiting a body with a point of view. I think that is why scent can be so emotional. It does not merely sit on the skin. It blends with heat, chemistry, memory, mood, weather, fabric, and movement. It becomes specific to a life. Specific to a season. Specific to a woman. That specificity matters to me more now than it used to. When I was younger, fragrance often felt aspirational. I wanted to smell elegant, mysterious, sensual, impressive. All of that had its place. But now I think about scent differently. I think about what it returns me to. What it steadies in me. What it says without my needing to explain myself. Some fragrances make me feel sharper, more composed, more capable of entering a room with clarity. Others make me feel softer, warmer, more private. Some smell like a woman who has plans. Others smell like a woman who has come home to herself at the end of the day and is not apologizing for wanting peace. That is why scent became part of my identity again. Not because I needed another beauty step. Because I needed another way to feel present. Smell is so closely tied to memory that it can bypass language entirely. A certain note can pull me back to a hotel lobby in Chicago, a winter coat, a velvet dress, a conversation I can still feel in my chest. Another can remind me of childhood lotion, the polished wood of an old dresser, the women in my family getting ready for church, the sacred ordinary beauty of watching someone prepare to be seen. Even the wrong fragrance can say something useful. It can remind me of who I was trying to be when I bought it. It can reveal an old longing, an old insecurity, an old fantasy. Scent does not just accessorize identity. Sometimes it exposes it. And perhaps that is why I became more intentional about it. I stopped buying fragrance the way people buy distraction. I stopped treating perfume like a trendy object that should excite me for a week and then disappear into a drawer. I started slowing down. Testing on skin. Walking around in it. Letting it dry down. Asking whether I still liked it after an hour, after a day, after my body had finished speaking back to it. There is a difference between admiring a fragrance and wanting it to live on me. I had to learn that. Budget changed how I approached this too, but in a way that made me smarter rather than deprived. Not having unlimited money can be clarifying. It forces honesty. I no longer wanted a shelf full of expensive confusion. I wanted one or two scents that genuinely felt like me. I wanted fragrance with emotional staying power, not just pretty packaging and a burst of novelty. That made me much more patient, and much more selective. I also learned that smelling good does not begin with perfume. It begins earlier, closer to the skin. Clean skin. Moisturized skin. Skin that holds scent because it has been cared for. I started paying more attention to layering. A body wash I loved. A lotion or oil that added depth. A fragrance oil when I wanted warmth without spending too much. A spray when I wanted lift, projection, or a final veil. Once I understood that, Fragrance became less expensive and more personal. I did not need to drown myself in perfume to feel enveloped by it. I needed a base, a rhythm, a little intelligence. There is something quietly luxurious about scented body oil, even on a tight budget. It turns the ordinary act of moisturizing into something more atmospheric. It lingers close. It moves when I move. It stays in clothes, on wrists, in scarves, on the inside of a coat. And if I am careful about the notes I choose, it can do almost as much emotional work as a high-end perfume. Sometimes more. There is a softness to oils that feels less public, more intimate, as though the scent belongs first to me and only then to the world. That intimacy is important. I think many women have spent years making themselves legible to others. Smell lets me keep something for myself. Even when someone else notices it, the experience still begins privately. I catch it when I lean down, when I move my hair, when I pull on a sweater, when I sit in the car at a stoplight and my scarf rises slightly with the heat. Those little moments matter. They remind me that being put together is not only about how I appear from across the room. It is about the atmosphere I create around my own life. There are scents I now think of as functional in the most beautiful sense of the word. One that helps me feel capable on workdays. One that feels warm enough for evenings, dinners, the kind of quiet outing where I want to feel feminine but not overannounced. One for colder months, with more depth, more wood, more amber, something that settles into wool and dusk. One for spring, when I want light without emptiness, freshness without smelling like I am pretending to be younger than I am. I do not need 10. I need enough to reflect the emotional weather of my life. That, to me, is the real elegance of scent. Not abundance. Alignment. The fragrance should meet the woman, not overwhelm her. It should deepen what is already there. If I am wearing something simple and beautiful, scent should complete the sentence. If I am tired and trying to gather myself, scent should offer steadiness, not strain. If I am in a season where life feels flat, a familiar fragrance can bring dimension back before anything visible changes. That is not shallow. That is sensory wisdom. Bodies respond to atmosphere. We all know this, even if we rarely speak about it directly. I also began caring more about the scent of my environment, not just my skin. Clean laundry matters. The inside of a coat matters. A handbag that does not smell stale matters. Sheets matter. The faint scent left on a cardigan matters. When I walk into my bedroom at night, I do not want to feel I am entering a storage unit for exhaustion. I want some trace of softness there. Something clean. Something calming. Something that lets the space around me participate in my care instead of merely containing my fatigue. That does not require extravagance. It requires attention. A linen spray. A drawer sachet. A bar of soap left in a closet. A small ritual of scent that tells the nervous system, this place is tended to. And perhaps that is why fragrance became meaningful to me again. It was never only about smelling attractive. It was about ending the era in which everything in my life had to justify itself through utility alone. Scent reminded me that presence has texture. That a woman can leave an impression without raising her voice. That being grounded in myself sometimes begins with something as invisible as a note of amber, clean musk, neroli, vanilla, cedar, rose, or citrus meeting the warmth of my skin and staying there long enough to say, softly, "You are still here." That is no small thing. To smell good, for me, is not about becoming someone else. It is about making contact with myself again in one of the oldest, deepest languages the body knows. Memory. Atmosphere. Recognition. The invisible thread between how I move through the world and how the world lingers back on me. And once I understood that, fragrance stopped being an extra. It became part of how I returned to my own life. Nails, jewelry, and the small details that whisper instead of shout. By the time I started paying attention to the smaller details, I had already learned something important. A woman does not usually look put together because of one dramatic thing. It is rarely the expensive coat alone, the perfect haircut alone, the right lipstick alone. More often, it is the accumulation of quiet decisions. The kind that do not beg to be noticed, but change the entire impression anyway. That is how I came to think about nails, jewelry, and all the little finishing touches that seem minor until they are not. They whisper. And sometimes a whisper shapes a woman more powerfully than anything loud ever could. I think this becomes clearer with age. When I was younger, I associated style more with impact. I noticed the statement piece, the dramatic shoe, the bag everyone recognized, the outfit that announced itself before the woman even spoke. There is nothing wrong with any of that. But as I got older, I found myself more drawn to the kind of beauty that holds its power quietly. The woman whose look is not shouting for validation, but is so considered, so coherent, that you feel her presence before you fully understand why. Often, the answer lives in the details. Clean nails. A ring that catches light when she reaches for a glass. A watch that suggests she values time without being ruled by it. Small gold hoops she wears so often they seem like part of her face. A handbag that is not extravagant, just cared for. Shoes that are simple, but polished enough to say she did not forget herself at ground level. Those things do not create a character. They reveal one. That was the shift for me. I stopped thinking of details as extras and started seeing them as signals. Not signals to impress strangers, but signals that I had finished the thought. That I had taken the time to complete the sentence of my appearance. And there is something deeply stabilizing about that. To know that even in a basic outfit, even on an ordinary day, I can add a few deliberate details that make the whole thing feel inhabited instead of accidental. Nails were one of the first places I noticed this. Not because I believe every woman needs elaborate manicures or endless salon appointments. I do not. In fact, I think the opposite can sometimes distract from the real point. What matters more is that the hands look maintained. That they do not feel forgotten. Hands tell the truth about a life. They reveal labor, stress, care, age, weather, habit. They are visible in every conversation, every exchange, every moment I hand someone a card, hold a steering wheel, lift a coffee cup, sign my name, touch my own face. When my nails are chipped, ragged, or neglected, I feel it more than I can explain. Not because it makes me less worthy. Not because a woman must always be polished to deserve respect. But because it introduces a small note of disorder that follows me all day. I notice it when I type, when I reach, when I glance down. It becomes one of those tiny preventable irritations that quietly lowers the tone of the whole experience of being me. And the opposite is also true. Neat nails, even the simplest ones, create a feeling of completion. Clear polish. A soft neutral. Short, clean, shaped. Even just cuticles tended to and hands moisturized. It does not have to be dramatic to change the way I feel. There is dignity in maintenance. There is calm in looking down at my own hands and seeing evidence that I did not rush past myself entirely. I feel similarly about feet, though women rarely speak about them with much reverence unless summer demands it. But I have learned that private maintenance has its own emotional value. Soft heels. Trimmed nails. A little attention paid to the parts of me that spend most of their lives hidden in shoes. That matters, if only because I know it. It is one more way of resisting the idea that care only counts when it is visible to other people. Jewelry taught me something slightly different. Jewelry is where memory and style begin to overlap in a more personal way. Clothes come and go. Sizes change. Trends pass. But jewelry often stays close to the body in a different register. It absorbs history. A necklace worn for years becomes part of how I imagine my own neckline. A ring begins to feel less like an accessory and more like punctuation. Earrings worn over and over become part of the emotional architecture of a face. I started understanding this when I stopped chasing jewelry as novelty and started choosing it as language. What do I actually reach for? What do I trust when I want to feel quietly finished? What pieces soften me? What pieces sharpen me? What looks like me, not just what looks pretty in isolation? Those questions made me much more selective, and much more at peace with owning less. I no longer felt the need to collect endlessly. I wanted a few reliable things. Pieces that worked with the life I was actually living. Not too precious to wear, not so trendy that they dated me by next season, not so loud that they required an entire identity to support them. Just pieces with enough clarity that they added shape without taking over. That might look like a thin chain at the collarbone, a pair of hoops, a delicate bracelet, a simple ring that anchors the hand. Sometimes a watch instead of more jewelry, because there is something deeply elegant about a woman who knows that practical can also be beautiful. I became more interested in objects that could accompany me daily than objects I had to build a special occasion around. And I think that is part of what makes the details so grown. They are not always about display. Often they are about continuity, about building a visual identity strong enough that repetition becomes part of its beauty. When a woman always wears a certain metal, a certain scale of earring, a certain shape of ring, it begins to feel intentional. Familiar. Grounded. Not because she lacks imagination, but because she has found the register that suits her. There is sophistication in that kind of restraint. I also had to learn that the small details are only as convincing as their condition. A beautiful bag with peeling edges tells a different story than the same bag cleaned and cared for. Shoes matter this way too. I do not care how good the outfit is if the shoes look exhausted in a way that suggests neglect rather than wear. Scuffed leather, collapsing structure, heels that have clearly seen more years than attention can dull the whole effect. Not because everything must be perfect, but because the eye reads these things faster than the mind does. Worn-out details create visual static. The same is true for eyeglasses, sunglasses, wallets, even the inside of a handbag. A woman can look composed from the outside and still feel slightly unraveled every time she reaches into a chaotic bag full of old receipts, broken pens, loose gum, and lipstick without a cap. I know because I have lived that contradiction. And I have learned that organization is part of elegance too. Not obsessive neatness. Just enough order that the objects I rely on are not working against me. A cleaned-out bag. A card case that is not splitting at the seams. A pair of glasses that suit my face rather than merely helping me see. A keyring that does not look like a junk drawer. These are not grand gestures. They are small harmonies. They make the life around me feel less fragmented. There is also something emotionally powerful about one good piece that feels almost heirloom-like, even if it did not come from family. A ring I saved for. A bracelet I bought to mark a hard year I survived. Earrings worn on days when I need to feel a little more like myself. I do not think women need luxury to access this feeling. But I do think we need objects with meaning. Things that connect style to memory, presence, and personhood. A piece does not have to be expensive to become symbolic. It only has to be chosen with sincerity and worn long enough to absorb part of a life. That is the difference between accessorizing and self-definition. The older I get, the less I want details that scream. I want details that deepen. Things that add texture without noise. A woman does not always need more volume. Sometimes she needs more precision, more editing, more care, more willingness to finish what she started. I have found that even on the days when my outfit is simple, when my energy is not especially high, when life feels ordinary and unglamorous, the details can still hold me. They can keep the day from slipping into carelessness. They can remind me that subtle does not mean forgettable. In fact, some of the most memorable women I have ever seen were not extravagant at all. They were exact. Their nails were neat. Their jewelry was consistent. Their bag made sense. Their shoes were cared for. Their appearance did not beg to be admired, but it made an impression because nothing felt random. That is the kind of beauty I trust more now. Not louder. Clearer. Not trying harder. Finished more honestly. Nails, jewelry, and all the other small details became meaningful to me because they taught me that refinement often lives in the final 10%. The part many people skip because it seems optional. But that last layer is where intention becomes visible. It is where effort becomes elegance. It is where a woman quietly tells the truth that she has not only dressed herself. She has accompanied herself, all the way to the edges. And those edges matter. Because a life is often felt there first. In the fingertips. At the wrist. On the ears. In the objects I carry. In the little things that say, without ever needing to shout, I was here too. The private habits no one sees are usually the reason a woman looks so put together. The older I get, the more I believe that what people call effortless is usually just private maintenance no one happened to witness. When a woman looks put together, people tend to focus on what is visible. The outfit. The hair. The skin. The jewelry. The perfume. But I have come to believe that those things are only the surface evidence of something deeper, quieter, and far less glamorous. Behind almost every woman who appears composed is a set of habits no one applauds because no one sees them. Small things. Repetitive things. Things done half awake, late at night, in a bathroom mirror, in a laundry room, in a kitchen, in the first 10 minutes of a morning when nobody is filming and nobody is praising her. That is where much of a woman's elegance actually begins. Not in the moment she walks into the room, but in the invisible life that carried her there. I used to think looking put together was mainly about taste. And taste matters, of course. But taste without support can only go so far. A beautiful coat does not save a woman who slept 3 hours, cannot find anything, is running on coffee and panic, and is pulling wrinkled clothes from a chair on her way out the door. At some point, the body and the home and the pace of a life begin to speak through the appearance, whether I want them to or not. That was a difficult truth for me because it meant that the answer was not always more beauty products or better styling. Sometimes the answer was less romantic and much more honest. More sleep. Better laundry habits. Water. Food at regular intervals. A calmer entryway. Clothes put back where I could actually find them. Fewer mornings that began in chaos. Less pretending that I could neglect the foundations of my life and still float above them looking serene. I think many women live in that contradiction for years. We learn how to create a polished exterior while quietly exhausting the conditions underneath it. We know how to pull something together. We know how to improvise. We know how to compensate. We know how to become highly functional in systems that do not support us very well. And because we can do that, we often miss the point at which resilience stops being admirable and starts becoming expensive. Because there is a cost to always rescuing myself at the last minute. There is a cost to sleeping too little and hoping concealer will negotiate with my face. A cost to eating irregularly and wondering why I look depleted by noon. A cost to letting clean laundry pile up unfolded until every morning feels like a scavenger hunt. A cost to living in visual clutter and then acting surprised when I feel mentally crowded before the day has even begun. The private habits matter because they shape the nervous system that walks into the room before the outfit ever does. I began to understand this most clearly through fatigue. Not dramatic collapse. Ordinary, accumulated fatigue. The kind that settles under the eyes, flattens expression, shortens patience, and changes posture before I even notice it consciously. There is a look that comes from being underrested for too long, and no amount of polish fully disguises it. I do not mean women must sleep perfectly or otherwise they have failed some beauty standard. Life is too real for that. But I do think there is wisdom in admitting that rest shows. It shows in the skin, in the gaze, in the softness of the mouth, in the willingness to move more slowly rather than jerkily through a room. Rest is one of the most invisible beauty practices there is. Not because it makes a woman look younger in some cliché way. Because it makes her look less at war with the day. The same is true of nourishment. I do not say that in the language of diets or control or body panic. I mean something more basic and more compassionate. A woman who has not eaten enough often wears it in her face long before she names it in her body. Irritation. Dullness. A scattered quality of attention. Shoulders slightly higher than they need to be. A look of having been pulled too thin across too many obligations. Food, water, pauses, something substantial before the second cup of coffee, these sound almost embarrassingly simple. But so much of what we call radiance is just a body that has not been ignored all day. Hydration is like that too. Nobody compliments it directly because it has no spectacle. But a woman can feel the difference between moving through a day dry and moving through it replenished. Dry skin, dry lips, a headache I pretend is just stress, fatigue I insist is personality, all of these become part of the visual field eventually. The body always enters the room with me. Whether I have listened to it or not becomes visible over time. I also had to become more honest about garments themselves. There is a quiet authority in clothes that have been cared for. Not expensive clothes. Cared for clothes. Steamed instead of wrinkled into surrender. Lint rolled. Hung properly. Buttons secure. Shoes wiped down. Sweaters depilled. Bras that are not exhausted. Undergarments that do not make the whole outfit feel compromised from underneath. These details sound domestic in the least glamorous sense, but that is exactly why they matter. Private order creates public ease. A woman whose closet supports her will always look less harassed than a woman whose closet fights her every morning. That support is built in the unseen moments. Folding instead of piling. Putting the earring back where it belongs. Keeping a tailor's safety pins, fashion tape, a lint roller, and a small sewing kit where they can actually be found. Taking 5 minutes at night to see what tomorrow requires instead of asking the morning to solve what the evening neglected. I used to underestimate that last part. The night before life. I thought getting ready belonged to the morning. But some of the most put-together women I know have simply learned how not to leave everything for the version of themselves who is half awake and already behind. They fill the water bottle. They set out the vitamins. They check the weather. They steam the blouse. They place the shoes by the door. They make the morning smaller. Kinder. Less dramatic. That kind of kindness matters more than ambition in daily life. And then there is posture, which almost no one includes in beauty conversations even though it changes everything. A woman can be wearing the right things and still look disconnected if she moves like she is apologizing for existing. I do not mean that in a harsh way. I know what it is to hunch through periods of stress, to lead with the forehead, to carry fatigue in the chest, to fold inward without noticing. But I also know that when I sleep a little better, breathe a little deeper, and stop rushing quite so violently, my posture changes on its own. Not into performance. Into presence. How I walk matters. How I stand in line matters. How I set my bag down matters. Whether I am always scrambling matters. Grace is often just the absence of unnecessary hurry. That realization changed how I think about home too. Not as a showroom, but as a support system. A calm corner where I get ready. A mirror that is not surrounded by chaos. A place for keys. A place for shoes. A place for the bag I carry most often. Enough order in the entryway that leaving the house does not feel like escaping a pile of unfinished life. I think clutter is more emotionally expensive than many women admit. It creates friction. It fragments attention. It makes each transition harder. And because getting ready is itself a transition, the home either steadies that process or drains it. I became especially aware of this during hard weeks. Not good weeks, when everything is easier and I am more naturally available to care. Hard weeks are where the private habits tell the truth. A life that only works when I am well rested, focused, and emotionally clear is not actually supportive. So I started building for the version of me who is grieving, distracted, overbooked, hormonal, discouraged, or simply tired of being the one who remembers everything. A spare deodorant in the car. Lip balm in every bag. A neutral emergency outfit that always works. Snacks in the work tote. A backup pair of earrings. A blazer that can rescue almost anything. A routine simple enough to survive a difficult Tuesday. Preparing for bad weeks is one of the kindest forms of elegance I know. Because it acknowledges that I am not always going to meet life at my best, but I still deserve support when I do not. That is the deeper truth underneath all of this. The private habits no one sees are often the real reason a woman looks put together, because they are not actually about appearance alone. They are about whether her life includes infrastructure for her own humanity. Whether she has made room for the body that carries her. Whether she has reduced avoidable friction. Whether she has stopped requiring heroics from herself every single morning. The women who seem effortlessly composed are not always the women with the most money, the best genes, or the most enviable closets. Often they are the women who have learned how to respect the backstage of their lives. They know that beauty leaks from hidden places. From sleep. From order. From food. From repaired hems. From water. From posture. From not living in constant visual and emotional emergency. I trust that kind of beauty more now. Not because it is perfect. Because it is earned in private. In the folded sweater. In the clean sink. In the prepared bag. In the 8 extra minutes. In the refusal to let every day begin in chaos. That is what people often see without knowing they are seeing it. Not just style. Support. And a woman who is supported by her own life carries herself differently, even before she says a word. Looking good every day was never about vanity. It was about not abandoning myself. In the end, I had to tell myself a truth that was quieter than ambition and deeper than aesthetics. Looking good every day was never really about vanity. It was about whether I was willing to keep showing up for myself in visible ways, even when life felt unresolved. That is the part one think gets misunderstood. People hear a conversation about appearance and immediately sort it into familiar categories. Surface. Ego. Performance. Insecurity. Consumption. Trying too hard. Not trying hard enough. They place beauty on one side of the moral line and seriousness on the other, as if a woman cannot care about how she presents herself without being somehow less substantial, less wise, less evolved. But I do not think the matter is that simple. Not anymore. Not after living long enough to understand how easily a woman can disappear inside a life that still looks perfectly respectable from the outside. What I was trying to recover was not glamour. It was contact. Contact with myself. With the woman I had become and the woman I was still becoming. With my own body, my own face, my own presence, my own right to take up a little more deliberate space in the life I was already living. I was not trying to turn myself into a fantasy. I was trying to stop treating myself like an afterthought. And those are not the same thing. There is a kind of self-abandonment that happens so gradually it can pass for maturity. A woman becomes practical, efficient, adaptable. She stops asking for much. She cuts corners only where the corners belong to her. She keeps things moving. She becomes the one people can rely on. She lowers maintenance, lowers expectations, lowers visibility. She learns how to survive on less attention, less softness, less pause, less care. She does not call it abandonment because abandonment sounds dramatic, and what she is doing looks anything but dramatic. It looks sensible. That is why it is so easy to miss. I missed it for years. I thought I was simply growing up, getting realistic, focusing on what mattered. And in some ways, I was. Life does require that. There are bills, family needs, illness, work, grief, seasons when the ground is not stable enough for indulgence. I understand all of that more deeply now than I ever did when I was younger. But there is a difference between living responsibly and slowly deleting myself from the picture. There is a difference between simplifying and erasing. There is a difference between being tired and becoming invisible to my own attention. That difference became the center of everything for me. Because once I saw it, I could no longer pretend that neglecting myself was morally superior to caring for myself. I could no longer keep dressing, grooming, and moving through my days as though I were merely supporting cast in my own life. I could no longer ignore the emotional consequence of seeing myself only as a machine for getting through things. Something in me had grown too tired of being useful without also being tended to. And that is what this entire journey came down to. Not becoming more attractive in some generalized, externally approved sense. Not becoming younger. Not becoming trendier. Not becoming more enviable. Not becoming a woman other people would look at and assume had everything together. It was about refusing to keep participating in my own disappearance. I think that is why the changes that mattered most were never the loudest ones. They were not dramatic transformations. They were small acts of continuity. Wearing the clothes that honored the body I have now. Caring for my hair without resentment. Letting hygiene become a form of return. Building a skincare and makeup routine that made me look present, not performed. Choosing a scent that reminded me I still had atmosphere. Maintaining the little details. Respecting the backstage of my life. None of these things solved my problems. None of them rewrote my history. None of them removed uncertainty, loneliness, heartbreak, aging, or the ordinary ache of being human. But they changed the companionship I offered myself while I lived through those things. That matters more than I knew. Because there are seasons when life does not give me resolution. It gives me ambiguity. It gives me responsibilities I did not ask for, endings I did not want, versions of myself I have not yet learned to love, and days that do not feel beautiful from the inside. In those seasons, I used to think care should wait until I felt better. Now I understand that care is often most sacred when life is not especially lovely. To wash, moisturize, choose, prepare, tend, and gather myself when nothing spectacular is happening is a quiet kind of fidelity. It says I will not only witness myself when I am thriving. I will remain here when I am uncertain too. That is not vanity. That is devotion. Not grand devotion. Not romanticized devotion. Just the plain, steady kind. The kind that looks like brushing my hair on a difficult morning instead of moving through the day already half detached from my body. The kind that looks like wearing the good earrings to lunch alone. The kind that looks like replacing the bra that no longer supports me, clearing out the drawer that keeps frustrating me, putting on perfume on a Tuesday, steaming the blouse, clipping the nail, drinking the water, folding the sweater, setting things out the night before. These gestures are so ordinary that they are easy to dismiss. But ordinary things shape a life. What I finally came to see is that a woman teaches herself what she is worth not only through the big decisions, but through the repeated texture of her days. Through what she allows. Through what she postpones. Through whether she keeps telling herself later, 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 until the years begin to collect around that word like dust around furniture no one touches anymore. Later can become a place a woman never leaves. I did not want to live there. I did not want to keep imagining that the real me would begin once I looked different, felt different, earned more, healed more, finished more, or had fewer people needing things from me. I did not want self-respect to remain trapped in the future tense. At some point I had to decide that the woman standing here, in this body, at this age, with this history, in this unfinished life, was not a placeholder. She was the life. That realization changed the emotional meaning of beauty for me. Beauty stopped being an ideal I chased and became a relationship I maintained. Not every day with the same energy. Not every season with the same ease. I am not talking about perfection. I am talking about remaining in contact. Remaining responsive. Remaining unwilling to let my own life happen around me while I vanish politely inside it. Some days that contact is elaborate. Most days it is simple. But even the simplest forms matter. Especially those. There is also grief in this, if I am honest. Grief for the years I spent assuming care had to be earned. Grief for the woman I was when I thought strength meant needing less tenderness. Grief for how often I confused endurance with wholeness. I do not say that to be sentimental. I say it because truth has a sadness to it when it arrives late. And yet even that sadness has become useful to me. It has made me more determined not to waste the years I still have by withholding from myself the very forms of care I would so easily offer to someone I loved. That is another truth I had to face. I would never look at a woman I loved who was tired, aging, overwhelmed, uncertain, or in transition and tell her to wait until she became more acceptable before she deserved to feel cared for. I would not tell her to wear the wrong clothes until she changed. I would not tell her not to buy the lotion, not to replace the shoes, not to take the extra 10 minutes, not to make her room gentler, not to tend to her hair, not to let beauty accompany her through difficulty. I would understand instinctively that care is not a reward for having an easy life. It is one of the things that makes a hard life more livable. So why had I believed the opposite for myself? That question still humbles me. And maybe that is where I want to leave this, because I think many women are standing at some version of that same threshold. Not broken. Not collapsed. Not in need of a total reinvention. Just tired of living half-claimed. Tired of looking fine while feeling faintly absent. Tired of treating themselves as secondary characters in lives they hold together for everyone else. If that is where I am, or where I have been, then maybe looking good every day can mean something deeper than the culture usually allows. Maybe it can be less about impressing the world and more about signaling to myself that I am still here, still worthy of attention, still someone I refuse to leave behind. That, to me, is the deepest secret under all of it. Not the hacks. Not the products. Not the budget tricks. Not even the routines. Just this. I did not want to abandon myself anymore. And once that became clear, everything else stopped being superficial and started becoming sacred in its own quiet way. Because I am not broken. I am just in the middle.